do functional breathing practices actually improve exercise performance? In this video, I want to dive into a study that has been looking at whether improving nasal breathing, integrating functional breathing practices that are aimed at improving the BOLT score, a test of chemoreceptor sensitivity from the Oxygen Advantage, does it actually lead to improvements in exercise performance? So this study was essentially looking at two different groups, a randomized control trial, looking at groups that were either given 4 weeks of functional breathing practices. So this is looking at nasal breathing during exercise, looking at having good breathing mechanics, but also reducing the volume of breathing to create a feeling of air hunger in their breath, which is sometimes termed as hypercapnic training because of the increase in carbon dioxide. Comparing that to individuals who just did 4 weeks of running and there was no focus on any additional functional breathing exercises. This was in recreational athletes. Within the methodology, essentially what they did is they measured on a graded step test or a VO2 max test. They looked at exercise performance, and the indices that they actually measured were one VO2 max, distance of the time of how far they could run or how long they could run for. Also, how long could they run for using nasal breathing only? And what's the maximum amount of oxygen that they're able to utilize when they were nasal breathing only? So they're the four indices that we're looking at, which would typically look at measuring oxygen, you could say breathing efficiency, as well as overall aerobic fitness. Interestingly enough, what they use to measure chemoreceptor sensitivity, or we could say CO2 tolerance in the words from Oxygen Advantage, they use the BOLT score, which is termed the body oxygen level test. Now, this is a test that I use regularly. I did the Oxygen Advantage training. However, I have noticed with a lot of my clients that it's so variable that I have kind of just weaned away and moved away from actually using this test as much as I used to. And I've actually created a 3-step breath test, which I'm actually going to pop a link to the ebook that I've created to do this test below. It's just a bit of a deeper test, gives more insight into physiology, psychology, as well as whether it's true chemoreceptor sensitivity. Anyway, so the BOLT score was a measure of looking at if we improve this, and therefore we improve someone's ability to tolerate carbon dioxide. The hypothesis is that that reduction in ventilation leads to an increase in carbon dioxide in the blood, which causes a right shift in what we call the Bohr effect, which makes us more effective at utilizing oxygen, better at delivering oxygen. And what did this study find? So over 4 weeks, what they found was there was no improvement at all in VO2 max. There was no improvement in the ability to nasal breathe and have a further distance or higher oxygen consumption or increased oxygen efficiency with nasal breathing relative to mouth breathing. They found no correlation between increase in BOLT score and any improvements in exercise performance. However, there was an increase in the BOLT score itself. So what does this suggest? Well, first of all, it kind of suggests that increasing the BOLT score itself doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to improve exercise performance. In fact, I would add on top of that, a BOLT score is a resting test measure. And obviously exercise isn't resting. It's a completely different state. In the Oxygen Advantage, they do state that the BOLT score can give us an indication of what resting breathing might look like, and therefore a comparison to what exercise breathing might look like and what sleep breathing look like. But that's not the case, because breathing is a behavior and breathing is state dependent. It's different when we are resting. It's different when we are paying attention to a task. It's different when we're exercising, particularly different intensities of exercise. And it's different when we are sleeping. So I think that's one of the reasons why there was no correlation here. This is not to say there aren't benefits to functional breathing itself. I just believe that these benefits aren't to do with exercise performance or physiological improvements in things like aerobic performance. This is not the only study to suggest that. There was also a study that was released last year that, again, they just found no correlation between BOLT score and exercise performance. This was in elite level athletes. So we've got recreational athletes as well as elite level athletes, two different groups with just no correlation between the two. Why could this be? Well, we've already mentioned prior to the state dependent of breathing, but also the other thing that we want to consider is that the BOLT score is a subjective test. It's a subjective test where variability is so easy. So if there's variability in the test, then how can we start to draw correlations? That's another thing that we need to consider. Now, in terms of the limitations of this study, is the fact that it's a small sample size. I think they only included 16 people in this actual study. So not a large group. We can't expand out to say that if there was more people that would get a different result. Another part of the study was that only the training was done over 4 weeks. It might not have been long enough to create adaptations that were impactful enough to change, although there was improvements in VO2 max in both groups. So there was enough stimulus and enough intensity within the training to actually show and demonstrate there can be changes in physiology. So there's a little bit kind of a question around that. The other thing is chemoreceptor sensitivity might not just impact breathing during exercise as much as we think it does. In fact, that is now the case. The more belief is that actually chemoreceptors are a backup system. They're a feedback system for when our brain and our nervous system incorrectly predict how we should be breathing during exercise. Our brain and our phrenic nerve continually will learn and update how we breathe based off emotional states, based off feeling states, and based off just movement. That system, which are feed-forward systems, which are primary systems, take precedence first. This is a behavioral element of our breathing. The chemoreceptors part of our breathing is feedback for when maybe that doesn't get things quite correct, and it can kind of titrate the breathing as we go along. So in this study, that is probably also one of the reasons to why we're not actually seeing any change or any improvement in exercise. What I do believe that doing functional breathing practices will improve is just things like emotional state, feeling relaxed, feeling able to tolerate more stress internally, being more emotionally resilient, recovery over a long period of time, longevity of an athlete. Now, this is more likely to occur because of the fact that actually it seems as though the adaptation that we're getting with where we start to see a bulk store increasing is actually a habituation to respiratory sensations, which is a habituation to what we call air hunger. Air hunger is a primary affect, an emotion, and our brain will start to change its relationship to that emotion. And as a result of that, yes, we can retain a bit more CO2 in the body. There are studies to suggest that with long-term nasal breathing, we can adapt and we become more efficient. We can get the same amount of VO2 max. We can run the same distance on 22% less breaths. That's a study with George Dallam, who I recently wrote a paper with on how nasal breathing potentially could be, or a hypothesis, that's why I said potentially, could be a protective factor against cardiac arrhythmia in elite endurance athletes. Again, I will pop a link below if you want to check out that study. If you enjoyed this video and you enjoy the breathing science, there are a couple of things that you can do to get yourself a bit more education in it. If you want to join our community space, I have a free community space that is available for people just if they want to get breath sessions. If you're an individual who wants to learn a little bit deeper, I also have a paid community area that has journal club. We have video portfolios, we have masterminds, we have resources and papers, we have discussions among peer groups. And as well, if you are an individual who is a breath coach that wants to become an expert and actually understand the deeper nuances that I've discussed in here and move away from a particular methodology and move into breathing science, you can check out the breath science certification at www.breathscience.com.au.